The cold, sterile office hums with tension as the CEO stands by his window, looking out over the city. Across the room, a man, his shoulders slumped, hands shaking, is handed a neatly folded letter. "You're no longer needed here," the CEO says, his voice smooth and devoid of emotion. The man, eyes wide with disbelief, stares down at the paper. His world has just crumbled in front of him, and with it, his hopes, his dreams, and his future. But fate has a way of turning the tables. Just days later, the same man, black, determined, and on the verge of despair, finds himself staring at his own face, now larger than life, on a towering billboard. How did it happen? How did he go from being discarded to becoming the symbol of triumph against all odds? This is a story of injustice, resilience, and an unexpected twist of fate that will make you rethink the systems that govern our lives, and how sometimes the people we try to erase have the power to rise far above. Stay with us. The office was a maze of glass walls, polished floors, and whitewashed cubicles that smelled faintly of overpriced coffee. For most, it was a place to thrive, climbing the corporate ladder, gaining power, becoming somebody. But for Elijah Thompson, this was just a cage. Every morning, as he stepped off the crowded subway and into the gleaming high-rise building, he fought the overwhelming weight of expectations that hung over him. As the only black man in a sea of white faces, he was used to feeling invisible, booked. Yet he had worked hard to carve a place for himself in the competitive world of tech, a place that felt like a beacon in a world that often didn't acknowledge his presence. At 32, Elijah had already accomplished what most people would call success. He had earned his degree from one of the top universities in the country, excelled in an industry where diversity was still more of a buzzword than a reality, and climbed his way up to a position where he had the ear of the CEO, Nathan Blackwell, a man whose name was synonymous with wealth, power, and a reputation for ruthlessness. Elijah's office, though small, was adorned with photographs of his family, his mother who had taught him to persevere, and his younger sister, a law student at Harvard who still looked up to him with pride. His walls weren't lined with diplomas or awards, but with words, quotes that had carried him through years of discrimination. "Rise above," one read in bold letters. "You are stronger than they think." Elijah believed in these words with every fiber of his being. But that day, as he sat at his desk, the weight of the world pressed down on him harder than ever before. It wasn't the usual pressure of deadlines or the stress of endless meetings. It was the growing realization that his worth in this company was still defined by something other than his abilities. Elijah had been overlooked for promotions countless times, passed over for projects that he knew could have made a difference. The other day, when he had pitched an idea that could revolutionize their next product launch, the CEO had smiled and nodded, but had handed the project to someone else. Elijah's heart sank with every dismissal, every quiet comment from his colleagues that felt like they were trying to push him back into the shadows. He was good at his job, better than most, but in this world, his excellence was always overshadowed by his skin color. In an office where his worth seemed to be measured by his race rather than his talent, Elijah knew he had to work twice as hard to be seen, and yet every success seemed to come with the same bittersweet aftertaste. No matter what he did, it would never be enough. His friend Maya, a junior developer who had been with the company for just under 2 years, always said he was too hard on himself. "Elijah, you've got to stop working like you have something to prove," she would say, as they sat together during lunch breaks. "You've got the skills, the ideas, the rest doesn't matter." But Maya didn't understand. Elijah knew how the system worked, knew how people like him had to navigate through a world built on privilege. To him, the idea of sitting back and waiting for recognition felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. One afternoon, as the sun began, casting long shadows across the glass walls of his office, Elijah glanced up from his computer screen to find Nathan Blackwell standing in the doorway. Blackwell's face was stern, his hands clasped behind his back, his tailored suit sharp enough to cut glass. Elijah's heart skipped a beat. Blackwell only came to his office when something big was happening. "Thompson, I need to see you in my office," Blackwell said, his tone flat without the usual warmth. Elijah stood up immediately, his mind racing. What had he done wrong? Had his last presentation not been good enough? He followed Blackwell down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the sterile silence. As they walked, Elijah couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled in his stomach. He had come to understand Blackwell's presence in the office as a harbinger of change, usually not for the better. The CEO was known for his high expectations, but also for his tendency to make decisions with little regard for the people they affected. They reached Blackwell's office, and as the door shut behind them, the tension in the room became palpable. Elijah couldn't place the look in the CEO's eyes. Was it pity or something darker? "Sit down, Thompson," Thompson, Blackwell said, gesturing toward the chair in front of his desk. Elijah did as told, his hands resting nervously in his lap. I've been thinking, Blackwell began, his voice smooth and deliberate, about your future here. You've done well in your position, but I've noticed your performance has plateaued. Elijah's stomach clenched. Plateaued? He repeated, struggling to keep his voice steady. Blackwell continued, barely acknowledging the disbelief on Elijah's face. We need someone who can bring in fresh ideas, someone who can inspire. Frankly, I think you've hit your limit. I've decided we're going to go in a different direction. The words hit Elijah like a physical blow. His breath caught in his throat as Blackwell slid a neatly folded letter across the desk. Elijah's eyes flicked to the paper, the words termination looming larger with each second. I'm sorry, Thompson, Blackwell said, his voice void of any real emotion. You're no longer needed here. Elijah stood, his legs trembling beneath him, but he forced himself to maintain composure. He could hear his heartbeat pounding in his ears as he took the letter and left the office, his mind racing. This wasn't just a job loss, it was a validation of every insecurity, every fear he had lived with since stepping foot into this company. In that moment, he felt like an outsider once again, discarded and forgotten. But what Elijah didn't know was that this painful setback would ignite something inside him, a fire that would drive him toward an unexpected and powerful future. The face of the man who was dismissed so easily by the system would soon be seen by millions not as a failure but as a symbol of resilience and triumph. What came next, however, would be a story no one could have predicted. Elijah sat in his apartment that evening, the world around him feeling distant and cold. His phone buzzed relentlessly with messages. Maya, his sister, a few colleagues, who had heard the news and were offering support in the form of half-hearted sympathy. His fingers hovered over the screen, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. Each message felt like a reminder of the rejection he had just faced, and he didn't know how to explain the shame that clung to him like a second skin. He leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the dimly lit skyline outside his window. The weight of it all crushed him, and he fought the urge to break down. How had it come to this? One moment he was a valued employee, and the next he was just another casualty in a system that never really saw him. He had given so much of himself to this job, sacrificed hours with his family, his own peace of mind, only to be discarded like he didn't matter. The injustice of it boiled inside him, a simmering rage that was unfamiliar but potent. The phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Maya. He didn't pick up immediately, but after a few more rings he answered, knowing she wouldn't stop until she heard his voice. Elijah, please talk to me. What happened? I can't believe it. I'm so sorry. Her words felt like a warm blanket in the storm of his thoughts, but even her kindness couldn't ease the ache he felt inside. It's over, Maya, Elijah said, his voice rough. He fired me, Nathan Blackwell, just like that. Maya paused, the silence hanging between them for a long moment. What? No, I don't understand. You've been there for how long? You've worked your ass off. This doesn't make sense. I don't know, I don't get it either, but it doesn't matter. I was never going to make it there anyway. No matter how hard I worked, I was always going to be the guy who didn't belong. Don't talk like that. You know you earned your spot, Maya urged, her voice steady, but there was a frustration there, an anger at the system, at the injustice of it all. It's not about that, Elijah muttered, slumping in his chair. It's about being the black guy in a room full of people who just don't see you as equal. You know how it is, Maya. We don't get second chances. He stared at the empty coffee mug on his desk, the remnants of an afternoon's distraction. How many times had he sat in meetings, holding back his thoughts because he knew his voice would be drowned out by others? How many ideas had he pitched, only to see them taken by someone else with the same privilege that came with their whiteness? His mind wandered back to that moment when Blackwell had told him that his performance had plateaued. How could it plateau when he had been asked to do everything, be the innovator, the leader, the role model, while still fighting for the space to simply exist? Maya sighed on the other end of the line. You can't let this destroy you, Elijah. You've got so much more to offer. Don't let them win. Elijah wanted to believe her, but at that moment, he didn't know how to rise from the depths of his anger and disappointment. How could he keep pushing forward in a system that was designed to hold him back? The next few days passed in a blur. Elijah didn't have the energy to look for another job. He just drifted through his routine, waking up late, avoiding phone calls, barely responding to emails. Maya came over to check on him a few times, bringing takeout and trying to pull him out of his funk. His mother called, but he couldn't find the words to explain how he was feeling. What could he say? That the world had proven him right all along? Then, one morning, as Elijah was scrolling mindlessly through social media, his eyes caught something that made his breath catch. A picture. A billboard. His face, larger than life. Bold, clear letters read, "Rise above, Elijah Thompson, a man who refused to be silenced." It was a campaign for a new initiative, something that promoted diversity in tech. Elijah's image, the one he hadn't seen in years, was plastered across the city. His jaw dropped as he realized what it was. His image was part of an ad campaign he had no idea about. His first thought was disbelief. How? How had they gotten this image? It was an old headshot from when he was still at the company, taken years ago during one of the diversity events that they had tried to push as a PR move. He had forgotten all about it, had buried it in the background of his memories because it had never meant anything real. It was just another checkbox for the company, a way to show that they had diversity without actually fostering change. But now his face was everywhere. The message, "Rise Above," was both a call to action and an ironic slap in the face, because in reality, Elijah had been told that his rise had been impossible. He had been told he wasn't good enough, that he would never make it. Who the hell did this? Elijah muttered, standing up, pacing the small apartment. His fingers trembled as he tried to call the PR department at his old company. When someone finally picked up, Elijah didn't hold back. "What is this? Why is my face on a billboard? I didn't authorize any campaign, and you know I don't believe in any of that diversity fluff you guys pretend to care about." The voice on the other end sounded stunned. Mr. Thompson, we didn't expect this reaction. The campaign was launched by the board. They decided to feature your image as part of our new diversity initiative." "Diversity initiative?" Elijah barked a bitter laugh. "You mean the same initiative that fired me for not being innovative enough? The one that promotes a few token faces while shutting out the people who actually have ideas?" There was a brief pause. "Mr. Thompson, I understand your frustration, but the board believes this is a positive step. We wanted to show our commitment to diversity." Elijah's voice shook with anger. "Your commitment to diversity is nothing but a marketing tool. You've built your empire on the backs of people like me, and now you want to use my face to make your company look good? Is that it?" The woman on the other end was quiet for a moment before she responded softly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson, but it's out of our hands now." Elijah's mind was spinning. Being fired for not measuring up to being the face of a diversity campaign? It wasn't just an insult. It was the culmination of everything he had fought against. A system that used his image to make themselves look good while continuing to silence his voice. And as the days passed, Elijah began to realize that this wasn't just about him. This was about a system that perpetuated the illusion of equality while maintaining its own power structures. And as he looked at his face on that billboard, glaring down at the city, he knew he had to take control of the narrative. The time for silence was over. Elijah wasn't going to be just a token on someone's wall. He was going to rise, whether the world wanted him to or not, and that was only the beginning. Elijah's anger burned like a wildfire that refused to be contained. His face on a billboard, his image being used by the same corporation that had discarded him. It was beyond ironic, beyond painful. It was a slap in the face, a cruel reminder of everything that had led to this moment. But as the days passed, something inside him began to shift. The frustration started to turn into something else, a quiet, simmering resolve. Elijah knew he couldn't let the narrative stay in the hands of a company that had treated him as little more than a token, a pawn in their game. The billboard campaign was only the beginning. What was worse, it had become a symbol of the system that had tried to keep him down. But now, that image was his face, his name, his story. It wasn't just theirs to control anymore. He began to spend hours in front of his laptop, the flickering screen casting long shadows across his apartment. It was a tiny space, but it had always felt like home, filled with mementos of his life, photos of his family, the old basketball trophy he had won as a kid, books that had shaped him. But now, even the familiar surroundings seemed distant. His mind was consumed with the need to speak out, to tell his story, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been overlooked, passed over, or ignored by a system that was designed to break them. It wasn't just about the campaign anymore. Elijah knew that to truly rise, he had to confront the ghosts of his past, the pain of discrimination that had followed him through every job he had ever held, the weight of always being the other, the anger that had grown inside him simmering, just waiting for an outlet. And now he had one. The phone call came in the middle of the night. "Elijah, it's Maya. You need to see this." Her voice was urgent, her tone frantic, and Elijah's heart skipped a beat. "What's going on?" "There's something happening with your billboard," she said, her breath quick. It's all over social media. People are tearing it apart." Elijah felt a chill crawl up his spine. What was happening now? Was this some new form of mockery? He grabbed his phone and opened Twitter, scrolling through the hashtags that were quickly gaining momentum. There, in bold letters, was the message, "Kjark Token Thompson." The posts were pouring in, some mocking, others filled with anger and disbelief. It wasn't just the billboard that people were commenting on. It was his entire story. The fact that a black man, fired from the company that claimed to champion diversity, was being used to promote that same agenda. The irony was too thick to ignore, and the internet was tearing it apart. Just another diversity hire for the optics. Token Thompson, one tweet read, fired for lack of innovation, but let's make him the face of diversity. Hypocrisy at its finest. Another user commented. Elijah stared at the screen, his blood running cold. This wasn't what he had imagined. He had thought that people would see the injustice of it all, that his image would be a symbol of defiance, but instead it had become a joke. The narrative wasn't his anymore. It had been hijacked, twisted into something that mocked him. People didn't see a man who had been wronged. They saw the punchline. He slammed the phone down onto the table, the sound of it reverberating through the silence of the room. His pulse raced as he fought to control the panic rising in his chest. This wasn't what he had fought for. This wasn't how he had planned to reclaim his power. But then something shifted inside him. Something that was stronger than the fear and humiliation he was feeling. Elijah knew he had to take control of the situation. The narrative had been hijacked, yes, but it wasn't over. In that moment, he realized that the only way forward was to speak his truth, to make them hear him. The next day he sat down at his desk, the weight of the world on his shoulders, but his resolve was clear. He didn't need to wait for the company or anyone else to give him permission to tell his story. He would tell it himself. He typed out a message on social media, his fingers trembling at first but soon finding their rhythm. The words that flowed from him felt like they had been waiting to escape for years. To the company that fired me for not being enough, and to the people who now mock me from the safety of their keyboards, this is my truth. You didn't see me. You saw what you wanted me to be. You saw a face that fit your agenda, but you didn't see my worth. You didn't see my struggle. And now you will. I won't be your token anymore. I am Elijah Thompson, and I refuse to be silenced. He hit send. His heart raced as he stared at the screen, watching the post go live, the notifications flooding in almost immediately. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but he didn't know what to expect. Would this be the end of the story, or the beginning of something greater? As the minutes passed, Elijah saw the support pouring in. Friends, strangers, people he hadn't spoken to in years, they all began to speak up. The tweets shifted. The hashtags changed. From the Token Thompson, it became Rise with Elijah. Elijah Thompson, you are not a token. You are an inspiration. This world is better because you exist. Rise with Elijah. Rise with Elijah. This is the power of standing up, of not letting the system define you. Your story is our story. The flood of messages hit Elijah like a wave, and for the first time in days, a sense of hope began to replace the bitterness in his chest. The world was listening. They saw him finally. It wasn't just the words, though. It was the people. It was the thousands who shared his story, who stood with him. Elijah realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a collective struggle. The messages weren't just about his fight for recognition. They were about all the people who had been passed over, overlooked, and discarded. His pain was their pain. His story was their story. As the hours passed, Elijah's phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't social media, it was an email. He opened it, his hands trembling as he read the words. We are deeply sorry for the way we handled your departure from the company. We would like to discuss a potential reconciliation and the possibility of an apology to the public. Please, let us know if you're open to speaking. For a moment, Elijah didn't know what to feel. The apology came from the company's public relations team, but he wasn't sure it mattered. The damage had been done. His journey had already begun, and he wasn't going to let them rewrite it. His phone rang again. This time, it was Maya. Elijah, do you see what's happening? The whole narrative is changing. You're changing it. Elijah exhaled, a deep breath of relief mixed with uncertainty. It's not over yet, but it's a start. The shift was undeniable now. Elijah Thompson, the man who had been discarded, had become something greater than anyone could have imagined. He wasn't just a face on a billboard. He wasn't just a casualty of a broken system. He was a voice, a force, and he was ready to take on whatever came next. And in that moment, Elijah realized that he hadn't been alone all along. The world had been watching, waiting for someone to rise. And now he was doing just that. Days passed, and Elijah's world began to shift in ways he hadn't anticipated. The support from his post had been overwhelming, but more than that, it had been real. People who had known him only as the quiet, hardworking guy at the company now saw him for who he truly was. A man who had faced discrimination, rejection, and hardship, but still stood tall, unapologetically himself. The online movement that had grown around him wasn't just about a single person's story anymore. It became a movement, one that carried the weight of countless other stories, stories that had been buried under the pretense of equality and fairness. People who had been silenced by systems that took their labor but gave them nothing in return were finding their voice in Elijah's struggle. But even with the solidarity from the world, the real change, the resolution, came from the moment Elijah made a decision. It wasn't going to be enough to just vent his frustration, to just fight back for the sake of it. He had to do more than expose the hypocrisy of the company that had fired him. He had to create something real, something lasting. One evening, as the sun set over the skyline of the city, Elijah sat at his desk again, his laptop open in front of him. The screen reflected his face, his tired eyes, his furrowed brow, but also the faint glimmer of hope that was now slowly creeping into his heart. He hadn't been ready to let go of the anger, not entirely. He still felt the weight of it, still wanted to yell, to shake the people who had hurt him and countless others. But that wasn't what was needed now. What was needed was a vision, a movement that would rise above the broken systems, that would ensure the voices of those who had been ignored would never be silenced again. It was then that his phone buzzed with an email. He opened it quickly, the words jumping off the screen. "We are writing to request a meeting with you, Elijah. We understand that the company has failed you in many ways, and we would like to offer an apology, as well as discuss the possibility of reconciling with you publicly. We would like to take steps toward changing our diversity practices and acknowledge the harm caused by our actions." The email was from the board of directors at the company, Nathan Blackwell's company. It was a public relations move, sure, but it was one that made Elijah pause. Was this truly an apology, or was it simply a way to save face in the wake of the backlash? He had no illusions about the company's motives, but something inside him knew that this was the moment that would define whether things truly changed or not. It wasn't just about taking the apology and moving on. It was about holding them accountable. He knew what he had to do. The following week, Elijah walked into the gleaming office building of the company that had once been his home. The polished floors, the walls adorned with motivational posters and images of happy, smiling people. It was all too much to bear. It felt like walking into the belly of the beast, where the illusion of progress was constructed with the sweat and tears of people like him. He could already hear the familiar words in his head, the same ones that had been used to justify every painful decision made by the company's leadership. "We're working on it. Diversity takes time. We've made progress." But Elijah was no longer the man who would sit in the back and wait for change to come. He had learned something in his journey. The fight for true equality could never be passive. It was not enough to sit back and hope that things would get better. It was something that had to be fought for every single day. As he entered the boardroom, the faces that greeted him were those of Nathan Blackwell, a few other high-ranking executives, and the company's PR team. They all sat at the polished conference table, eyes glued to him as if they were waiting for his judgment. Elijah took a seat, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew one thing. He was in control now. "Elijah," Blackwell said, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "We're glad you could meet with us today. I hope you understand that this is a step toward acknowledging the mistakes we made and moving forward with you." Elijah stared at him, his gaze unwavering. Acknowledge the mistakes? He repeated. Is that really all you're going to do? You're going to apologize and act like nothing happened? Like firing me, like excluding me from the opportunity. To rise, like reducing me to a token, none of that matters. Blackwell shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It's not just an apology. We want to make things right. We want to show you and the world that we are committed to doing better. Elijah leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. Do better. He let the words hang in the air before he continued. You think that an apology is going to fix the fact that I was never given a fair chance? That I was overlooked for every opportunity, not because of my work but because of the color of my skin? Do you really believe that simply doing better means you've changed everything? There was silence in the room. The executives seemed unsure how to respond, unsure if they should challenge him, if they should simply agree and apologize. More. But Elijah wasn't waiting for their validation anymore. His eyes moved around the room, locking with each of theirs. You think I'm angry at you? You think I'm just bitter about getting fired? That's not why I'm here. I'm here because there are thousands of others like me who never even had the chance to fail. There are people who've been pushed out, who've been made invisible because they don't fit your idea of what success looks like. You need to stop hiding behind your empty promises and actually do something to change that. His words were like fire, and the silence that followed them was a weight none of them could escape. Elijah stood up, pacing slowly, his gaze still, on Blackwell and the others. I'm not here for your apology. I'm not here for your charity. What I'm asking for is accountability. Real accountability. You want to show that you've changed? Then prove it. Prove it by creating spaces for people who aren't just the right people in the eyes of the corporate world. Prove it by giving voices to those who have been silenced for far too long. Prove it by leading in a way that isn't just for show. It was a moment of clarity for him. Elijah realized that this was the power he now held. Not just to demand apologies, but to demand action, to demand true change. Blackwell looked around the room, exchanging uneasy glances with the others. It wasn't the response Elijah had expected, but it was enough. We can do that, Blackwell said slowly, his voice tentative. We can start by creating a mentorship program. We can pledge to implement real changes in hiring practices and provide the necessary resources for growth. We want to partner with you, Elijah, in making these changes. Elijah nodded, not fully satisfied but not willing to walk away just yet. I'll hold you to that, and I'll be watching. I'm not the only one. As he left the boardroom, Elijah felt a mix of emotions. There was no victory in this moment, not yet. But the fight had shifted in his favor. The company's apology was only the beginning of a long journey, a journey that would require constant vigilance, a journey that would demand that those in power be held accountable for their actions. And as he walked through the building, he realized something else. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. His voice, once small, had become part of a larger chorus of people demanding change. And no matter what came next, Elijah knew that his journey had only just begun. The power was his now, and it was time to use it. To rise not just for himself but for everyone who had been forgotten. Elijah's story is not just the story of one man overcoming adversity. It is emblematic of a much broader and deeply entrenched issue in society. The systemic racism that continues to affect people of color, particularly Black individuals across various facets of life. The struggle he faced within the corporate world, where he was used as a mere tool to portray diversity rather than embraced for his true potential, serves as a microcosm of the pervasive discrimination that exists in many industries, communities, and even in personal interactions. To fully understand the depth of Elijah's battle, it's important to reflect on the larger societal framework in which these events took place. In a world that claims to celebrate meritocracy, where everyone is supposedly given the same opportunities to succeed, the reality is much more complicated. The narrative that hard work and talent will always lead to success has often been a false promise. particularly for marginalized communities. Instead, the people who are most vulnerable are often silenced, pushed aside, or used to fulfill quotas, only to be discarded when they no longer fit the desired image or narrative. This kind of systemic bias and tokenism is not a new phenomenon. Historically, Black people and other people of color have been subjected to the whims of white-dominated institutions and power structures, which have consistently treated them as second-class citizens. The idea of using Black people or other marginalized groups to serve the interests of corporations, whether as symbols of diversity or as statistics in an effort to appear progressive, is a form of exploitation that has been happening for centuries. In the case of Elijah, his worth was reduced to an image, something the company could commodify, yet never truly recognize as valuable. Tokenism, as seen in this story, is not about true inclusion or equity. It's about fulfilling an image or meeting a requirement without actually addressing the core issues of discrimination, underrepresentation, and the lack of real opportunities for marginalized groups. This is not an isolated incident. There are countless other stories, some less visible, of individuals facing the same kind of treatment. For example, in 2019, a study conducted by the National Bureau of Economic Research showed that Black Americans with white-sounding names were 50% more likely to receive job interview callbacks than those with distinctly Black names. This is the type of institutionalized racism that continues to affect Black communities. Though there may be policies in place promoting diversity and inclusion, they are often just surface-level solutions, designed more to avoid backlash than to foster real change. Furthermore, Elijah's story highlights the emotional and psychological toll of constantly navigating spaces where one is made to feel unwelcome, undervalued, or seen as a tool to further someone else's agenda. The constant emotional labor required to navigate these spaces is something many people of color face daily. For Elijah, his worth wasn't defined by his skill set or dedication. It was defined by his skin color, his ability to check off boxes in the company's diversity initiatives. This dynamic isn't just exhausting, it's soul-crushing. The psychological weight of constantly proving your worth in a system that already devalues you takes its toll. The story also illustrates the ways in which corporate structures can contribute to systemic oppression. Elijah's fight was against a corporation, but his struggle is in many ways a fight against a broader societal issue: the corporate world's reluctance to address the true challenges of racial inequity. Companies may implement diversity programs, but true systemic change requires more than just numbers on a spreadsheet. It requires reshaping corporate cultures that have, for decades, favored one group while marginalizing others. The importance of representation and fair opportunities within the corporate world cannot be overstated. When Black individuals or other people of color are given equal opportunities to rise, to thrive, and to lead, it benefits not just the individuals, but entire communities. True diversity fosters innovation, brings in fresh perspectives, and creates a culture where everyone's potential is nurtured, not dismissed. However, the system is rigged in favor of those who already have privilege, who already hold power, and for those individuals, the idea of sharing that power often feels threatening. To bring about real change, we must dismantle these systems of privilege, not just on a superficial level but on a deep, structural one. The story of Elijah serves as a call to action for individuals and institutions alike to do the hard work required to address inequality. It is a reminder that diversity and inclusion efforts are often performative and do not reach the heart of the issues at play. Real change requires the dismantling of old structures, the reevaluation of biases, and an honest reckoning with the past. One potential solution is the implementation of deeper, more comprehensive education on the historical and contemporary issues related to racism and privilege. If companies, institutions, and organizations truly want to create inclusive spaces, they need to move beyond sensitivity training and engage in long-term commitments to anti-racism work. This includes examining their hiring practices, revising their standards for promotion, ensuring fair wages, and developing mentorship programs that allow Black individuals and other marginalized groups to succeed. Accountability is also crucial. Institutions must not only commit to diversity initiatives, but also track the results of these initiatives. Are the individuals from marginalized communities truly being given opportunities to rise, or are they merely being used to satisfy quotas? The lack of transparency and follow-up within many organizations has led to hollow diversity efforts. Elijah's story teaches us that the fight for equality is not about mere representation, but about tangible change that is monitored, measured, and modified if it fails to meet expectations. Elijah's experience shows us that it's not enough to just break down barriers. We need to ensure that the spaces people enter are welcoming, nurturing, and truly inclusive. Diversity isn't just about bringing different people into the fold. It's about changing the way organizations function, making them truly equitable, and allowing people from all backgrounds to feel like they belong. At the same time, Elijah's story also reveals the power of individual agency within a larger oppressive system. By speaking out, by holding the company accountable, and by refusing to let his story be appropriated, Elijah reclaimed his narrative. The personal is political. When one individual fights for justice, it can ignite a movement that transcends their personal struggles. Elijah's courage gave others the space to speak their truths, and in doing so, he began to shift the very foundation of how the world viewed marginalized voices. This shift in narrative is key. Historically, those in power have controlled the stories being told about marginalized groups. They have shaped the narratives in ways that suited their interests, often ignoring or distorting the real lived experiences of those affected by racism and discrimination. But when individuals like Elijah step forward and take ownership of their stories, they change the narrative. They prove that they are not simply victims of an unjust system. They are survivors. They are warriors, and they have the power to change the world. Elijah's story reminds us that the battle for justice and equality is ongoing. It calls for courage, for speaking out even when the world is silent, and for the collective effort of everyone working to dismantle the systems that perpetuate injustice. There is no singular solution to the issue of systemic racism. There is no one-size-fits-all answer. But through constant vigilance, activism, and solidarity, real change is possible. As Elijah's story unfolds, it becomes clear that the fight is not just about one individual, nor is it confined to one industry or company. The fight for racial justice is a global one, a call for collective action that reaches beyond personal grievances and touches upon the very fabric of our shared humanity. And as Elijah continues to rise, so too does the hope that one day, everyone will have the chance to rise with him. In closing, we must remember that change is a long, often painful process, but it is through the efforts of individuals who refuse to remain silent, who demand accountability, and who advocate for real structural change that we can begin to break down the walls of oppression. Elijah's journey is a beacon of hope and a reminder that while the road to justice may be long, it is one worth traveling together. As we close the chapter on Elijah's story, it's impossible not to feel the weight of what has unfolded. A journey of resilience, pain, and triumph that speaks not just to one man's struggle, but to the struggles of so many others who have been silenced, ignored, or exploited for too long. Elijah didn't just fight for himself. He fought for every person whose worth has been overlooked, for every voice that has been stifled by the powers that seek to maintain control. His battle is a reminder that the road to justice is not easy, but it is a road we must all walk together. Elijah's courage to stand up against the very systems that had tried to break him is a powerful call to action for all of us. It challenges us to reflect on the ways we can contribute to the dismantling of oppression in our own lives, communities, and workplaces. It asks us to confront the uncomfortable truths about the world we live in, to acknowledge the inequalities that exist, and most importantly, to take steps to create a future where everyone, no matter their race, their background, or their identity, has the same opportunities to succeed, to be seen, and to thrive. But it doesn't stop with awareness. It requires action. Change begins with each and every one of us. If you've been moved by Elijah's story, don't just let it end here. Share it with others. Speak out when you see injustice. Stand with those who are being marginalized. Support companies, organizations, and leaders who are committed to real diversity and inclusion. Amplify the voices of those who are often silenced. And most importantly, never stop advocating for the change that is so desperately needed. We all have a role to play in this fight. It may feel overwhelming at times, but remember that each action, no matter how small, contributes to the larger movement. The change we want to see in the world begins with the choices we make every day. Are we willing to challenge the status quo? Are we willing to stand up when we see discrimination, bias, or inequality? Are we willing to be a part of something bigger than ourselves? Elijah's story shows us that no matter how deep the injustice, no matter how long the battle, there is always hope. There is always the possibility for change. Every step forward, no matter how small, is a victory. Every voice raised in support of equality is a voice that makes a difference. Every person who refuses to accept the way things are contributes to the collective movement that will one day create a world where justice is not a dream but a reality. We must not forget that the fight for equality, for justice, for kindness, these are not just abstract ideals. They are values that define the very fabric of our humanity. They are the principles that can unite us across differences, that can lift us up when we feel torn apart. And it's through these values that we can create a world where everyone, regardless of their background, can stand tall, be heard, and be celebrated. So, as we end this chapter, I urge you to reflect on what Elijah's story means to you. How will you contribute to the fight for justice? What steps will you take to ensure that future generations don't have to endure the same struggles? We cannot afford to be passive observers. The time for change is now. Let us all be the change we wish to see. Stand with Elijah. Stand with the millions of voices that have been silenced for far too long. Let's work together to break down the walls of injustice and build a world that is truly equal, kind, and just for all. Together, we are unstoppable. Together we can make a difference. Together we will rise. Take action now, share this story, engage with the conversation, and start your own journey toward creating a more inclusive world. The fight for justice starts with you. The world is waiting. Let's rise to the challenge.